think you can go.
Did they disappear?
Yes, you can go on.
I can go now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hi, this is Michael Weiss. I'm the Director of Special Investigations for the Free Russia Foundation. I'm very excited today to present, however unconventional a format this is, a very important report that was written by Casey Michel called Kill the Messenger, How Russian and Post-Soviet Oligarchs Undermine the First Amendment. But before we bring in Casey and start discussing this fascinating work, I wanted to introduce Natalia Arno, who is the president and founder of Free Russia Foundation.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yes, Natalia Arno. And for those of you who don't know Free Russia Foundation, you can understand the vision, the mission, and the goal of our organization by our name. We are fighting for a free Russia by assisting Russian pro-democracy movement, civil society, by telling the truth about the true nature of Putin's regime, its repressions and corruption domestically, and about its kleptocracy, disinformation, and influence campaigns globally. But what we enjoy in doing much more is to tell the world about successes and victories of Russian pro-democracy movement, civil society, and independent journalism. And I hope we will have more and more stories for you to tell. I'm very happy that today we are releasing this very important report for us on how post-Soviet, mostly Putin's oligarchs, violate the First Amendment. And it was authored by a prominent American author, Casey Michel. We are very happy for this collaboration. Also, let me thank Charles Davidson for his guidance and for his support to this project, and to Michael Weiss, who is moderating today's event and who also edited the report, and to our board member, Melissa Hooper, who for your very valuable comments. And also, let me thank everybody for your interest to this event. I looked at the RSVP list and I was so pleasantly surprised to see that we have not only our traditional audience, the US Congress, European Parliament, reporters, university students and professors, people from think tanks, from civil society groups, but also a driver, a musician, a 90-year-old retired engineer. So I'm very happy that our study is interesting for such a diverse group of people. And while I'm very sorry that we couldn't present this report in person, I'm also happy that this online format is allowing us to present it to people in Russia, in Europe, in Northern America, but even in Uganda and in Japan. So it's really great. And so for us, pro-democracy Russians, freedom of speech is a value that we have to fight every second of our existence. It's actually the reason why Free Russia Foundation was created in the first place, to become a voice for those who cannot speak up under the current Russian regime. Those of you who follow Russia closely know that Russians can be, if they speak up, they can be persecuted, harassed, arrested, even poisoned or assassinated. A simple tweet can lead to a 5-year imprisonment. So many of us had to flee from Russia to Western democracies, and it was a very shocking discovery for us to learn that even in Western democracies, there are attempts to silence us here. But what is even more mind-boggling for us is that those people, oligarchs that we are going to speak about, when they come to the West, they don't only bring their money, they also bring their corrosive practices, including intimidation of Western journalists, attempts to silence them. So I'm very happy that we are talking about this today, and I'm very happy that Casey authored this because he had a vast experience on this. So thank you so much. I cannot wait for this presentation. Michael and Casey, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Just on a slightly personal / professional note, I should say that myself as editor, Casey as author, and he's going to get into that, we have both been on the receiving end of this subject matter as journalists who have written about the practices and the financial relationships of various Russian and post-Soviet oligarchs. we've received any number of threatening legal letters, and I've had to do a kind of complicated dance with editors at various publications to water down language or even remove allegations and assertions that are well substantiated through evidence and prior reporting. So what I'm excited about with Casey's presentation of this project is the fact that this is also going to dovetail with his own work as a reporter. This is not merely an abstract academic exercise or report. So without further ado, let me introduce the author, Casey Michel. He's a former contributor to Think Progress. He's the author of a forthcoming book on kleptocracy, and he has sort of made it his bailiwick to go after dirty money in the United States, and focusing, I think, a lot on legal mechanisms by which some of that money can be stopped, and its corrosive impact on the American electorate can be halted. So, Casey, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the Free Russia Foundation for the opportunity to write this report. Thank you especially to Natalia for her wonderful guidance on this. And I'd also like to thank Paulina and Charles Davidson for helping push this along. And obviously, thank you to this wonderful audience we have with us today, none of whom I can see. I wish I was doing this in person, but this is what we are working with in this time of pandemic. The report, as Michael mentioned, is called Kill the Messenger. This report examines from a cohesive and attempting to be coherent approach how Russian and other post-Soviet oligarchs attempt to subvert, threaten, and manipulate the First Amendment and First Amendment protections. As you'll see in the report, there are a number of case studies examining how these oligarchs and these politically connected figures have used networks of enablers, have used their own financing, and have used their own legal teams to push, to prod, to cajole, and in certain cases outright threaten any number of Americans, any number of American institutions, and especially any number of American journalists in their attempts to whitewash their own image, expand their own networks of corrosive capital, and extend their own kind of political trajectory and political power, all of with the aim of extending the kinds of corrupt authoritarianism and kleptocratic practices they have perfected in countries in the post-Soviet space, most especially Russia. So as I just mentioned, the report itself, which is now available on the Free Russia Foundation website, goes through a number of case studies examining how about a half dozen Russian and post-Soviet oligarchs have used these tools, used these tactics, and used these practices to, again, subvert, threaten, and manipulate the First Amendment. Much of the research was done via open source and open resource research. That is to say, many of these case studies have been reported on by other American journalists, including myself and Michael in the past. But one of the things that the report does itself is bring all of these stories together, bring all of these case studies together to examine, again, these instances and these machinations in light of the First Amendment and First Amendment protections. Many of them focus on the journalistic experience. As Michael mentioned, my own prior and previous professional background is as a journalist for a number of publications, including, as he just mentioned, Think Progress, which is unfortunately no longer with us. It was a casualty of some of the realities within the digital media landscape. But not all of the case studies focus on journalism themselves. Obviously, the First Amendment provides a number of provisions and a number of rights: freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition, that these oligarchs and oligarchic figures have also exploited. There are as we get going into this presentation, there are a number of case studies that I did want to highlight, actually 3 particular case studies I wanted to highlight to really give a flavor of what this report presents, of some of the findings that this report uncovers, and some of the recommended policies that we have moving forward, which we can get into a little bit later in the report. First case study that I wanted to highlight is actually a personal experience of mine, which I thought provided a nice bit of color and insight and on the ground experience of what it's like to cover some of these figures. This was about 2 years ago, I was working, as Michael mentioned, as a journalist at a publication called Think Progress, which was actually housed out of, although editorially independent from, the Center for American Progress, which was a think tank in DC that is run by John Podesta, who some of you may recall was Hillary Clinton's campaign chair in 2016 and had his emails swiped by a number of Russian hackers. This research that I was doing at the time focused primarily on, again, the networks pertaining to, related to, and in the pay of a number of Russian oligarchs. One of them was a gentleman named Victor Vekselberg. That name may be familiar to a number of you. Mr. Vekselberg is a Russian financier, a Russian industrialist, made much of his money in the Russian energy sector. He is perhaps best known for repatriating a number of Fabergé eggs back to Russia. He reportedly spent about $100 million on these Fabergé eggs, and he also said that President Putin, whom he is very close to, was apparently overcome with emotion when these Fabergé eggs were returned to Russia. Now, obviously, President Putin is not especially known for being overcome with emotion very often, but I suppose when it comes to eggs, he may be, and I suppose we'll have to take Mr. Vekselberg at his word. Vekselberg was sanctioned by the U.S. in early 2018, and when those sanctions came down, obviously relating to not only the Kremlin's kleptocratic practices, but how those manifested themselves in 2016, in the 2016 interference efforts. When those sanctions came down, there was an immediate scramble for investigating his networks of American assets, which may be frozen immediately thereafter. Now, it turns out that Vekselberg's holding company, his primary company called Renova, did have an American subsidiary called Columbus Nova. There were a number of stories about how this Columbus Nova company had actually funneled $500,000 to a Delaware LLC that was connected to Michael Cohen, who is President Trump's former lawyer, who is now in prison. But that was a little bit tangential to what I was working on. My research actually uncovered that this Columbus Nova company had, in 2015, purchased an American video game company, of all things. And I and a number of other journalists and a number of other users of this video game company immediately wondered, why would a Russian oligarch be interested in American video games? Now, it's possible he certainly saw this as a growth industry. It's possible he's a gamer himself and likes to unwind and relax with rounds of Mario Kart in the evening. I don't know. I'm not one to put it past him. I certainly enjoy a few video games from time to time. But the question remained, why was his company investing in this? And one of the theories propounded by myself, other researchers focused on illicit capital, and other users of this video game company themselves, floated the theory that this was actually a means of money laundering, that is to say, transnational cleaning of illicit capital. It just so happened that this video game actually specialized in the kinds of games that academic researchers have identified as being perfect for this kind of transnational money laundering. There are in-game purchases that can be made that allow capital to travel from one user to the other without any kind of regulatory apparatus found. And I'll read just one quote, because there hasn't been much academic research on this. There's certainly no regulatory apparatus as it pertains to money laundering in video games. But one quote that I thought stood out to me from academic literature said that using the virtual currency systems in these games, criminals in one country can send virtual money to associates in another country. Then the virtual money can be transferred into real money, with the criminals leaving no trace of evidence authorities could follow back to them. All of that is to say, this did seem like a perfect vehicle for money laundering. So we wrote the story up. We highlighted the actual financial connections between Vekselberg's network and this video game company, which were very public. This had been in public press releases. There had been analysis written about the relationship prior to the sanctions. The story goes up. It includes a little bit of the material and literature on money laundering in video games, and propounds a theory that maybe this is what was happening, maybe not. We didn't make any outright accusations. As soon as the story goes up, we are immediately met with an absolutely unprecedented bit of blowback from this video game company, from its legal team, from the lawyers in the pay of the company that is obviously connected to Vekselberg itself. I have covered these figures for years. I have written any number of articles in the dozens, if not at the hundreds at this point, and I have never encountered the kind of blowback that I and my editor and my publication received when we wrote about money laundering in video games. I certainly was not expecting it. Threats of lawsuit, threats of pressure, condemnation, verging on harassment at a certain point in terms of the pushback. My editor, to his credit, stood by me, stood by the reporting. We ran it by the legal team. Everything was above board before publication. Everything was above board after publication. But unfortunately, management did not want to see this through, did not want to see the potential for a lawsuit through. And if that came, did not want to have to file the fees to combat this legally. And unfortunately, within a few days, despite my reporting and despite my editor standing by me, unfortunately, management decided that they were going to crumple and they were going to cave. And they were going to be able to, or they were going to decide to remove any hint of any discussion of and any research on money laundering in video games. The story remains up, but it's cut about in half. There's an editor's note at the bottom expressing regret for the story itself, even though there was nothing factually wrong and even though there was nothing incorrect about the reporting. I want to highlight this story because, well, for two reasons. One, it encapsulates the kind of blowback that reporters like myself receive from these oligarchic figures. But two, to get back to this notion of transnational money laundering, the lack of regulatory apparatus surrounding it, and kind of policies that can be propounded and pushed through this kind of reporting. Over the last 20, 25 years, this regulatory apparatus overseeing and trying to track, trace, and manage kleptocracy and money laundering, especially in the US, it doesn't emerge from nowhere. It doesn't emerge from a vacuum. It emerges because of American journalists covering these networks, highlighting these stories, highlighting these networks, putting that material in the public space and in the public domain, then having legislators or their constituents realize, recognize, and implement the kinds of policies to push this and to combat this. Unfortunately, in the 2 years since this story first came out, there has been next to nothing regarding transnational money laundering in this kind of digital space, in this kind of digital domain. Even though there has been academic research on it, there's still no kind of regulatory apparatus monitoring, tracking, and tracing this, despite the clear links, as we've seen, to Russian oligarchs. So that's one case study I wanted to highlight from my own personal experience. The other one that I wanted to highlight, and then I'll turn this back to Michael, is that of a gentleman who's not actually a Russian oligarch. He is somebody who was born in the Ukrainian SSR in Odessa during the Soviet period. He moved to Britain and then the US in the 1980s. He obtained American and British citizenship. So he doesn't even have Russian citizenship, but he nonetheless fits all of the trappings of what we would describe as a post-Soviet oligarch. Now, this is a gentleman named Len Blavatnik, who some of you may be familiar with. Mr. Blavatnik has been a case study for any number of phenomena that we have seen emerge from the post-Soviet space, both as it pertains to making billions upon billions of dollars in the energy sector while remaining close to President Putin and the Kremlin, while working closely with a number of sanctioned oligarchs, all of which allow him to fit what we would consider to be the oligarchic mold, while simultaneously using those hundreds of millions and in some cases billions of dollars in total to as donations to institutes, think tanks, universities, political parties, not only in the US, but also within European jurisdictions as well, to create this image of, craft this image of himself as a financier, as a philanthropist, as somebody who is worth getting to know and remaining in the good graces of. And as Michael mentioned, that this is one of the case studies also how this kind of illicit or allegedly illicit capital, questionable capital certainly, can slowly make its way also into the American political space. I'm just reading through some of the donations from Mr. Blavatnik: $200 million to Harvard, millions of dollars to Oxford to have the School of Government named after him, $13 million recently to the Council on Foreign Relations, which actually itself led to remarkable blowback from the American anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy community saying, what are you doing taking his money? We know what the source of this funding is. We know who he associates with. Even though he is not sanctioned by the US, there is no reason that you should be going anywhere near his financing. Mr. Blavatnik has had a number of articles written about him in the past. He has had a number of features everywhere from the New Yorker to the Financial Times written about his background and his source of funding. And if there is one thing that Mr. Blavatnik does not enjoy in this world, it is being described as an oligarch. So this specific case study looks at how Blavatnik's legal, PR, and consulting teams go out of their way to harass, to condemn, and to threaten journalists, especially in the US, that they will never, can never, and should never describe Mr. Blavatnik as an oligarch. Now, I had the experience in my research to actually go through and speak with a number of journalists who have covered Mr. Blavatnik and who've been on the receiving end of some of these threats, some of this harassment. And I will say, just to predate this or to predicate this, in the US, as well as in a number of American jurisdictions, or European jurisdictions, there is no anti-money laundering or due diligence requirements within the PR space, within the consultancy space, and within the lobbying space. That is to say, American lobbyists can hire whomever, whatever clients they want without any concern about the source of that capital. And that also extends to American lawyers as well, which is an actual, which actually exists in contradistinction to the European example, which has the EU recommends that all lawyers, all legal teams do their due diligence about the sources of capital for their clients. In the US, anything goes. Lawyers can hire, can obtain whichever clients they want. Lobbyists can obtain whichever clients they want, no matter the source of the capital. All of that is to say that Mr. Blavatnik has gone out of his way to hire as many white shoe law firms, as many high-powered lobbyists, and as many bulldog PR folks as he can to make sure that he is never described as as an oligarch itself. And I want to just highlight one quote from one of the journalists that I spoke with, who's been on the receiving end of a number of these emails and threats themselves. And this journalist said, quote, "The first time I called Blavatnik an oligarch, his PR guy emailed once an hour. In the past, that probably worked. And my understanding is that at other publications, that did work. But the emails literally verged on harassment. The emails from him were really crazy, but I didn't care. Blavatnik's PR person wanted me to justify why I called him an oligarch. But you don't," and this is a direct quote, "you don't get into a pissing contest with a drunk," end quote, which I think sums up the experience of what it's like to be on the receiving end of these letters, these emails, these phone calls. Now, this journalist fortunately had an editor in a publication who was willing to back this journalist up, stood by the story, stood by the description of Blavatnik as an oligarch. But some other journalists weren't quite so lucky. One journalist I spoke with estimated that up to 50% of the material that this journalist had uncovered on some of these oligarchs detailed in this report was on the cutting room floor, even though it was factually backed up, even though it was perfectly accurate, and even though it helped flesh out the stories this journalist was working on. The legal teams were too concerned. They were too threatened by these assertions of impending lawsuits and impending threats that they saw fit to cut up to half of the material that this journalist had uncovered about these networks of enablers, these networks of financing and these networks of corrosive capital that never saw the light of day. And readers were all the worse for it. Other journalists like myself were all the worse for it, and other elements and actors, obviously within the regulatory apparatus and in the government itself, were the worst for it, because that material, it never came out. It was never published because these threats, this harassment, which by all appearances appeared to be getting worse and worse by the year, seems at the same token to be increasingly effective year in and year out. There are real consequences for these threats. There are real consequences for these teams of enablers, of PR people, of legal teams, of consultants that seem to be working. And I will say, just to close, as I turn this over to Michael, there was a piece in Barron's magazine just the other day. Excuse me. Obviously, a very well reputed financial, a bit of financial analysis. Obviously, a renowned financial newspaper and outlet, and it was running through a number of high-powered financiers and what they had provided for the coronavirus report. And one of those that they described was Mr. Blavatnik. So you have the Bill Gates of the world, you have the Warren Buffetts of the world, and then you have the Len Blavatniks of the world, and it described him as a British American financier and and philanthropist. There was nothing about his Soviet roots, his connections to the Putin government, his sorts of wealth in the Russian energy space. He was simply a British American philanthropist doing what he could to make sure that the world recovered from coronavirus. So I'll turn it back to Michael.
Great. Thank you very much, Casey. I just wanted to point out to people watching this and listening to this on YouTube, you have the ability to comment and to ask questions. I can see the questions in text form, and I plan to poach some of them and ask them of Casey. But before I do, I have some questions of my own. So, yeah, Casey, one of the things you grapple with in this report is defining what an oligarch is, right? And this is a bit of a it's a loaded term. It's also become, frankly, something a bit of a cliche over the last several decades. I mean, David Hoffman's book, which is the kind of seminal text on the oligarchs from the Yeltsin period,
Kind of right behind me.
right. It created this kind of, catch-all term. But I wonder if you could describe a little bit what distinguishes an oligarch, say, from just a billionaire financier or somebody who decides to break ground on any number of charities or cultural organizations, or lives the jet set Davos lifestyle.
Right. No, oligarch is, in a certain sense, a relatively amorphous term. That is to say, there is no technical threshold. If it's $1 billion in total assets, if it's $5 billion in total assets, if it's $15 billion in total assets, that marks the meeting of the threshold for what we would term or describe as an oligarch. And this is actually one of the reasons and rationales that Blavatnik's team has put forth why he should not be described as an oligarch, because there is no technical definition that they feel he meets in describing him that. But I will say, in the popular usage of the term, and as we outline in the report itself, an oligarch is any individual, and they are almost entirely men, who made their, and this is within primarily in the post-Soviet space, who made at least 10 figures in total assets. That is to say, billions of dollars in total assets. Excuse me, through the generation of relationships with the governing body, whether it's in Moscow or in Astana or in Baku or in Minsk, through relationships that they have cultivated with the ruling party, ruling power, and ruling regime. They are individuals who are industrialists. They are individuals who are investors. They are individuals who made their money through natural resource extraction, all through and with the blessing of that ruling clique and that ruling claque. They are traditionally not those individuals who enjoy or who who hold governmental positions themselves. That is to say, they are not necessarily ministers. They are not necessarily members of the actual, the intelligence community, or members of the actual ruling regime themselves. They are nominally independent actors. They are nominally businessmen, and they are nominally removed from the governing structure themselves. However, that is not to say that they don't, again, enjoy the good graces of and attempt to cultivate the relations with that ruling regime. Now, in the Russian case in particular, as Hoffman's book outlines so well, and as any number of other books, including Karen Dawish's Putin's Kleptocracy from a few years ago, highlights so well, there have actually been multiple waves of oligarchs in Russia over the past, now 30 years. There was an initial wave that came to power underneath President Yeltsin. These are folks like Boris Berezovsky, who, and his network, that were able to obtain a wealth of assets, most especially through the 1996 Loans for Shares program, which allowed them to obtain, Russian mining rights, Russian extraction rights, Russian hydrocarbon rights, all for supporting the Yeltsin government. Now, when President Putin came to power in 2000, there was a second wave of oligarchs that followed him through, and that have since risen to power with his support and with his largesse, all while working in tandem to increase governmental oversight, increase governmental control, and increase especially regime control of these industries and of these assets. These are again individuals like Vekselberg. These are individuals like Oleg Deripaska, who is mentioned in this piece itself. These are individuals like Vladimir Yakunin, who is mentioned in the report itself. What was interesting about the Yakunin example is that he actually was a governmental minister for years and years. He was the head of the Russian railways, allowing him to also obtain billions upon billions of dollars that, as the report outlines, he poured into networks of Western enablers, Western academics, American academics, in order to, again, try to whitewash his image and eventually try to lift sanctions, frankly, on him and on his colleagues. He's no longer a member of the government itself. He retired from the Russian Railways position in 2015. But he, again, fits the traditional mold of what we would describe as an oligarch. He did serve as a governmental figure for years as well. So that is kind of the loose overview of what we would use to term as an oligarch within this space. Obviously, there are oligarchic figures that exist in Venezuela, in China, in Syria as well. But obviously, this report focuses on the post-Soviet experience.
So really, it doesn't come down to your net worth per se, although we agree it's got to be at least in the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, or thereabouts. But it's really to do with this either unspoken or de facto, or frankly, maybe even explicit relationship between that money and the government under which it was made, originally at least, right? I mean, oligarchs are seen generally as emissaries or kind of plenipotentiaries of these either post-Soviet, satellite states in the Caucasus and Central Asia, or indeed the Russian Federation. So you cannot, for instance, be someone like a Deripaska or an Abramovich without basically kissing the ring in the Kremlin, right? Or doing the bidding of the Kremlin in terms of public affairs. So, go and buy a soccer team, go and buy, in the case of Mikhail Prokhorov, the New Jersey Nets, right? Do this as a way to kind of sanitize or to burnish the image of Russian power and wealth and quote unquote democracy abroad. Is that what distinguishes them, say, from, you mentioned Bill Gates. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg could be described as an American oligarch, given, sort of the power that he wields with social media. I mean, that seems to be the kind of core definition.
Yes, you're exactly right. And one of the things that this report details is that these oligarchic figures are, as you just mentioned, vessels for, emissaries for the kinds of large-scale operations, machinations, and policies propounded by and envisioned by, in this case, the Russian state itself. That is to say, they are mechanisms with which the Russian state, obviously the ruling regime, the Putin regime, can push, can cajole, can convince networks of Westerners, in this case Americans, to their side, to their narrative, to their image crafting efforts, et cetera, without actually going through the primary mechanisms of the state apparatus itself. One of the interesting things I think with Mr. Vekselberg's case is that actually, as you just mentioned, there are any number of purchases or donations. One of the things that Vekselberg has been connected to is actually the rehabilitation of the former Russian outpost in California called Fort Russ in Northern California. Now, on its face, this seems like something that is perfectly fine. It seems like something that is perfectly worthwhile and something that is perfectly preferential. This is an incredible piece of North American history in terms, especially obviously of the Russian colonial era, and its rehabilitation should theoretically be welcomed. However, there is obviously overriding concern about the overall goal and overarching aims of Vekselberg in these investments, given his close relationship with President Putin, given the source of his wealth, and given the fact that he is now sanctioned specifically by the United States of America. And I will say, for anyone who's interested in an actual roster of specifically Russian oligarchs, the American sanctions regime is an excellent place to start, especially over the last few years, because there have been a number of figures, Vekselberg, Yakunin, Deripaska, obviously not Blavatnik because he is an American citizen, who have been sanctioned by the U.S. for their specific oligarchic role in affecting and in effectuating and in expanding Russian efforts abroad. And we saw that manifest itself most explicitly in the 2016 interference efforts that Deripaska, that Vekselberg, that Yakunin, that Konstantin Malafeyev were all specifically connected to, in some cases,
the sanctions element is interesting because it lends a kind of governmental legitimacy to seeing these guys as what you might call non-state state actors. Again, there's always that sort of that thread that ties them back to either the Kremlin or the presidential palaces in the former Soviet Union states. But here's the problem, right? And here's what you also kind of delve into in this report. In the United States, unlike in other countries, including Western democracies such as, for instance, the United Kingdom, which has very stringent libel laws that tend to put the burden of proof on the defendant or the journalist. In the United States, we have a First Amendment, right? And your argument is what these guys are very adroit at doing is not silencing people per se, not getting federal agents to come and raid their offices or take down blog posts or online articles and publications. It's just drowning journalists in legal headaches and as you described it earlier, sort of a kind of tortious harassment. So hiring white shoe law firms, PR agencies, consultancies to bombard not just the writer of an article that might be unflattering or scrutinizing of an oligarch and his operations, but the editors, the owners, the publishers of the publication, essentially creating this sort of cost-benefit ratio, right? Like, is it worth even doing this kind of investigative journalism if at the end of the day you drop your story and the story then gets rewritten, not because it's wrong or factually inaccurate, but simply because the owner of the company you work for, the media company you work for, doesn't want to get taken to court and doesn't want to have to go through the whole dance with somebody who has vast and far greater than they do resources, right? So what is your proposal for trying to sort of undermine this undermining of the First Amendment? How do we walk that fine line between adhering to the tenets of the Constitution whilst also saying, look, reporters have the right to dig into somebody's background and they shouldn't be subject to this kind of harassment and abuse?
Right. I think that your description of this response as kind of a tortious harassment is spot on, right? This is exactly what is happening in terms of emails, in terms of threats, in terms of, in some cases, the actual lawsuits, all in the effort of chilling reporting, stalling actual coverage, smothering any kind of inquiry into the sources of income, into these networks in which this financing is traveling, into the actual manifestation of these networks and of their efforts themselves. The simple answer, frankly, to this kind of, or to undercutting and kneecapping this kind of harassment, is that the U.S., while it does maintain a significantly higher threshold for defamation or libel suits than, for instance, the United Kingdom, in which the onus, the legal onus, is on the actual publishers and the reporters themselves. In the U.S., the onus is on the subject to prove defamation and libel, and it has to actually be proven that it came with a malicious intent rather than it was simply factually inaccurate. The simple answer is that the U.S. federal government, not state-level governments, not local municipalities, not territories, the federal government needs to pass what is called an anti-SLAPP, S-L-A-P-P, piece of legislation. And SLAPP, for those who are unaware, and I'll just read, that stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. Now, that is simply an acronym used to describe what we have seen take place in some of these cases outlined in the actual case studies in the report. These kinds of frivolous lawsuits that are based on nothing and that are simply meant to convince editors that and management that the threat of the lawsuit itself, the cost associated with the lawsuit, even if the publication actually wins, which in many cases they usually will because the threshold is so high in the US, even that doesn't mean that they will necessarily prove victorious. There will be significant costs incurred. There will be significant time expended and effort expended that could have been better spent elsewhere, convincing the editors and management that it's simply not worth writing these stories if there is going to be a frivolous lawsuit filed. Now, a number of American states have passed this kind of legislation, and a number of very prominent American politicians, journalistic associations, and legislators have recommended the passage of this kind of legislation, which would immediately, without any costs incurred, throw out these kinds of lawsuits. And I do want to mention what that actually kind of looks like, just briefly, because this is also detailed in the report itself. I mentioned Oleg Deripaska, I believe, earlier in the presentation. Deripaska came to, remarkable notoriety in the U.S. in terms of coverage of the 2016 interference efforts, not specifically for anything that he personally did, in terms of social media networks, or in terms of meetings with President Trump's campaign in 2016. Rather, it was because of his relationship with Paul Manafort, who was actually Trump's 2016 campaign chief. Now, Mr. Deripaska had a long-standing relationship with Manafort that dated back to at least the early 2000s. There was a report in 2017 published by the Associated Press describing and detailing this relationship between the two of them, noting that Mr. Manafort owed Mr. Deripaska millions of dollars, excuse me, for prior work, and detailing some of that work that they actually accomplished together, including plotting out and planning certain policy memos regarding how Russia could, the Putin government could increase its standing with and influence within a number of other countries abroad. That is to say, Manafort and Deripaska had, according to the AP, worked closely in terms of plotting out how to increase Russian influence elsewhere. Now, Mr. Deripaska, probably unsurprisingly, did not take kindly to this coverage, did not enjoy this story, and he did what some of the other oligarchs, again, as detailed in the report, actually threatened to do. He hired a white shoe law firm called Boies Schiller to go through and actually follow through on these threats. He wasn't simply interested in sending harassing emails. He wasn't simply interested in harassing phone calls. Instead, he, via his law firm, his American law firm, filed suit against the Associated Press, which is, again, maybe one of, if not the most storied, straightforward news outlets and news entities in the U.S., not especially known for any kind of political bias or political slants, very much held in very high repute within, especially the American journalistic community. But Deripaska paid no mind to that reputation. He paid no mind to the actual reporting. When the story broke, he filed a claim that said, and I'll just quote, that the AP had lied with a, quote, dubious chimera of accusations about his relationship with Paul Manafort, and claiming that Mr. Deripaska had suffered a, quote, special harm. So this isn't just in the realm of threats anymore. This isn't just in the realm of harassment anymore. This is an actual lawsuit that he and his team of American lawyers filed for no good reason, without any claims of any kind of factual inaccuracy, just to go through with proving that they could file a lawsuit, that they could follow through on the threats, that they could cross that what had been previously red line regarding what it took to chill the kind of coverage, to smother the kind of coverage that they did not want out there. Now, the American judge presiding did relatively quickly, within a few months, toss out the lawsuit itself. The judge said that Mr. Deripaska had, quote, cherry-picked sentences, and said there was, quote, no doubt about a public controversy between Mr. Deripaska and the Kremlin, also with whom he is very, very close. Right. The lawsuit was thrown out. I mean, Deripaska filed another lawsuit in Russia that, as far as I'm aware, is ongoing. But even though the AP won this lawsuit, even though the AP proved victorious, it nonetheless incurred costs, and it nonetheless exhibited an example that he, and presumably his other colleagues within the oligarchic space, will be more than happy to actually follow through on these threats. Now, I think what's actually interesting, about the Deripaska example itself is that it's not just that he was actually filing a lawsuit in order to chill coverage. Another way that he actually ended up going through and subverting or manipulating, or whichever term you'd like, the First Amendment and First Amendment productions, is that he is the only oligarch I'm aware of in this report that was actually allowed to write an op-ed staking his case, staking his claim, tossing cold water on any accusations of interference out of Russia in 2016. This was I believe it was 2018 op-ed that was published in the pages of the Daily Caller, which is, something you may be familiar with. It was a publication founded by Tucker Carlson. It's generally considered a right-wing publication. But in it, Deripaska pushed all kinds of conspiracies. He said that it was the deep state and George Soros who were combining to undercut President Trump, et cetera, by kind of placing as many conspiracies as he could in there, all of which ended up with him claiming that he was in no wrong, and this was all a manifestation of this cabal of people who wanted to undercut Mr. Trump, at that point, President Trump, his aspirations. And oh, by the way, why don't we also go through and lift sanctions on Russia? Because what do we want, if nothing else, than good relations between the U.S. and Russia moving forward? And I will say it's interesting that the Daily Caller not only allowed him to write this piece, but described him in his bio as simply a founder of a large Russian aluminum company, which is, I suppose, technically accurate, but absolutely misses the forest for the oligarchic trees. So that is just another manifestation of how they have used the First Amendment to their own ends and to their own aims, in this case, especially to end up getting these.
Let's, I have about 15, 20 minutes, and I want to start turning over to some questions that we're getting online. And there's actually two questions that I think I can fuse into one, and it has to do with, shall we say, oligarchic interference or cultivation of American politicians. So the first question is about, do you have any evidence or proof of direct money flowing from any of these oligarchs that you studied to either the current presidential campaign of Donald Trump or even his rival Joe Biden? The second question has to do with, you've talked at length about Deripaska, but this is specific to Deripaska and his, quote, influence over Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. So I'm wondering, I mean, you can broaden this out too into terms of, okay, this isn't just about making your money in Russia, coming to the United States, building charities, buying news organizations or athletic clubs. It's also about trying to do a kind of soft version of lobbying, right? Or trying to infiltrate the American political system to some extent. What have you uncovered, and how has any of this, assuming there is anything that's been uncovered, how has it been litigated or silenced or stifled at all by some of these kind of frivolous legal complaints?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the short answer is as it pertains to 2020, no, right? There hasn't been any material or filings that I have seen, or as far as I'm aware, other journalists have uncovered regarding financial links between President Trump's re-election campaign and Vice President Biden's election campaign. I haven't seen anything in that vein as it pertains to 2020. Now, if we cycle back to 2016. Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the things that came out of the Mueller report itself and the kind of investigation, and filings that it uncovered there. The reason that if an American is aware, or an American news reader is aware of who Mr. Blavatnik is, it is because in the midst of the Mueller investigation, it came out that Blavatnik, who had prior to 2016, spent years donating to both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, congressional candidates, super PACs, et cetera, et cetera. He provided a relatively kind of even keel in terms of his donations. He was happy to give money to both sides. But in 2016, that changed. And he donated, as we have seen, about $6 million, million with an M, to President Trump's inauguration gala or ball or ceremony itself, which was a gobsmacking amount of money, and far more than he'd ever donated to any political entity, at least in the U.S. prior. What's interesting about that case is that there was an allegation that Mr. Vekselberg actually attended that ceremony, the inauguration ceremony, sitting at Mr. Blavatnik's table. Now, Blavatnik and Vekselberg, if I remember correctly, have both denied that. That is what the reporting indicated. Now, Vekselberg wasn't sanctioned at the time. He was sanctioned later, but that also goes back to highlight the relationship between Blavatnik and Vekselberg. Now, in the time since, Blavatnik has continued with the donations, obviously, as I mentioned, $13 million to the Council on Foreign Relations, which the entire community of American anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy voices, I mean, excuse me, really the who's who of the American anti-corruption community were up in arms about issuing public letters, issuing public statements, saying the Council on Foreign Relations said have nothing to do with this money. But Blavatnik has also continued donating to both sides of the political aisle. Most notably, at least in my case, is that he donated, if I remember correctly, he and his wife, about $250,000 to the DCCC, that is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is obviously not on the Republican side. And I reached out to the DCCC to ask them why they were accepting the money, and they never got back to me. But all of that is to say that he has absolutely continued his prior pattern of donating to both sides, and presumably will continue doing that moving forward. Again, despite all of the linkages that we have uncovered regarding his relationship with a number of sanctioned Russian oligarchs, and despite everything that we have learned about his own prior history and his own kind of prior pattern of donations themselves. I initially answered this question saying we don't know. We haven't uncovered anything pertaining to donations regarding President Trump's reelection campaign or President Biden's election campaign. Just because nothing has emerged doesn't mean it's not happening. And this gets back to one of the case studies that I've been investigating as it pertains to, again, this forthcoming book examining illicit capital and transnational money laundering in the U.S. And that is using anonymous shell companies to donate to things like super PACs that will then move that money on to congressional campaigns, legislative campaigns, presidential campaigns. And I'm thinking most especially of the recent example that we saw come out pertaining to the cases of Igor Fruman and Lev Parnas, who were working at the behest of or in the close network of former Mayor Rudy Giuliani and obviously Ukrainian oligarch Dmitry Firtash as well. Now, there's no indication that they funneled any money pertaining to or emanating from Firtash himself into the American political system. Excuse me. However, they did funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars, according to American legal filings, through a straw man donation, perfectly anonymously, to American presidential campaigns. This is a phenomenon we saw play out in 2012 with a number of corrupt figures linked to corrupt Malaysian figures in the American presidential campaign. We saw that then. We saw that play out again with Parnas and Fruman in the post-2016 world. There's every reason to think that this is continuing as we move toward 2020, because again, at the end of the day, thanks to things like the formation of anonymous shell companies in the US, of which by all indications, the US is the world's biggest purveyor of, these things can continue without any of us any the wiser because of it. These are perfect vehicles for hiding those kinds of donations to PAC campaigns, candidates themselves.
I mean, a lot of the allegations that swirl around these various oligarchs, they go from simple, crony capitalist corruption into outright criminality, right? I mean, you described a story you did for Think Progress, which at least lent some credence to the idea that buying into a video game company was a way of conducting money laundering on the sly. So we have a question from a member of the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Look, it's one thing to talk about sanctions, which are mostly tied to the invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and what really kicked off in 2014, and then, of course, the election interference efforts in 2016. But why doesn't the Department of Justice do more to crack down and to prosecute if there really is a there to criminality and Russian or post-Soviet oligarchs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would love for the DOJ to pursue more legal cases, to pursue more cases of asset forfeiture, to pursue more filings and investigations pertaining to how these post-Soviet oligarchs, again, within this report, the scope of this report, manipulate First Amendment protections, but also extending to things like utilizing and using unregistered lobbyists to push their narrative, to whitewash their image, to whitewash the regime. Again, working not necessarily as governmental actors themselves, but obviously having worked in the working very closely with ruling regimes and ruling actors. And I think most especially, and Paul, that was a great question, and it's great to see you. And obviously, I think the world of the Helsinki Commission and everything they are doing there, and highly recommend everyone look through their slate of legislative proposals to counter corrosive capital, because they have been doing an absolutely phenomenal job. The case study that comes to mind in terms of DOJ, at least inaction thus far, is something that isn't actually mentioned in the report, that I've done some reporting on for outlets like the New Republic recently, is the case of a Moldovan oligarch Vlad Plahotniuc, who is this kind of gray cardinal, gray eminence out of Moldova over the past 15, 20 years, had an incredible lobbying machine in Washington as recently as 2016. Now, he was actually sanctioned by the U.S. just a few months ago. Secretary of State Pompeo came out and said, due to the massive allegations of corruption and presumed corruption on Plahotniuc's part, we are sanctioning him, removing or implementing a visa ban. He cannot come to the U.S. Any longer, and we are issuing a public notice about him. And that's fine. And that was perfectly welcome, fantastic, and overdue. Now, it just so happened that a few weeks later, or maybe a month or two later, it came out, and this was from some fantastic reporting from Radio Free Europe, that Plahotniuc wasn't hiding out in Moldova. He wasn't hiding out in London. He was hiding out in Miami. He's in southern Florida, by all indications, despite the visa ban issued against him, despite the sanctions issued against him. He is still down there. We do not know why. We are not entirely sure why he is allowed to remain in the U.S., or even if that is legally permissible, despite the visa ban, despite the sanctions. Now, the addendum to that story that I have worked on is that there is every indication that part of his lobbying operation in the White House included the current acting director of national intelligence, the current ambassador to Germany, and the current special envoy to the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, a gentleman named Richard Grenell, who does hold all of those titles and all of those hats simultaneously. Grenell never filed any of his work on behalf of whitewashing Plahotniuc with the Department of Justice. He never filed any paperwork with the Foreign Agents Registration Act. By all indications, he did exactly what Paul Manafort did in terms of his own links in that part of the world. And obviously, there were DOJ investigations and Mueller-related investigations into Manafort, and yet there hasn't been any indication of any kind of investigation on the DOJ side into Plahotniuc and into Grenell itself. I don't know why. There is every reason to think there would be, and that's not only extending to Plahotniuc, that extends to other Ukrainian oligarchs like Igor Kolomoisky, who had, as I'm currently researching, a network of American investments and American enablers across the U.S. in small steel towns, in places like Cleveland, Ohio, that by every indication were used as money laundering ventures through and through. And yet there hasn't been a DOJ investigation that I'm aware of or that anyone has seen therein. So there is ample room and ample space for increased DOJ investigations, and I would love whatever comes out of November for an increased emphasis on providing the resources for DOJ to go after these networks, these enablers, and these oligarchs themselves.
What would you say that, I mean, you know, the fact that so many of these figures have now been sanctioned by either the State Department or I think mostly the Treasury Department, right? Has that in any way relaxed some of the kind of furious and frivolous libel threats and all that? I mean, you know, I used to argue as a reporter that the one thing that government can do to help people like myself is put these people on sanctions lists, because then all of a sudden I can get away with a lot more in my tech, right? I mean, I can identify them as being sanctioned by the U.S. government, and that would seem to kind of indemnify me for making other accusations that are deriving therefrom. Have you, in your own work or in interacting with some of the reporters that you queried for the report, found that at least since 2014, and probably even more so since 2016, things have gotten a bit easier? I mean, you mentioned Deripaska taking one case to court, but they don't tend to usually go that far. It's you know, the kind of bombardment on email and all that. I mean, also there is a kind of ill odor in the air about Russian oligarchs, Russian influence peddling, Russian intelligence operations because of the Mueller report and the kind of obsession of this country for the last 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say the early indication is maybe a tentative yes, that this latest round of, or at least 2018 or post 2016, and then especially in 2018, round of sanctions on these figures did seem to have some kind of chilling effect as it pertains to the kind of lawsuits and threats and harassment that we saw. But again, that's only a very tentative yes. It's in many ways too early to tell. Yes, it's been a few years since these sanctions came down, but in the grand scheme of things, that's not much time. And that's not to say that there can't be some new round of investigations, some new round of revelations, and some new round of frankly, election cycle, especially with 2020 around the corner, that comes to bear, that leads to a number of other stories, or at least a number of other questions pertaining to these lawsuits and threats. frankly, I don't know, unfortunately, because this is obviously it's kind of a moving target, right? These sanctions come down. It's been relatively soon. There does seem to be some kind of indication that these sanctions, obviously, in terms of not only highlighting these figures themselves, but highlighting their networks, putting pen to paper with the governmental imprimatur that these are nefarious figures that we want nothing to do with, that they need to have their assets frozen, and that anybody working on their behest should think twice and will hopefully think twice about propounding and expanding upon their networks themselves. I mean, frankly, there's not a kind of a hard and fast answer to that. I will say, in that vein, one development that seems to have come to fruition is this notion of calling Blavatnik, Blavatnik an oligarch himself. Searching through the kind of public record, it wasn't until maybe 2017 or 2018, so the post-2016 world, that any publication saw fit to describe him as an oligarch. I think it's indicative that there was a recent Financial Times profile about him that included a wonderful paragraph saying that Blavatnik's PR people would only allow an interview with him if the outlet promised not to describe him as an oligarch, which I think encapsulates so much of that phenomenon. I've certainly seen
that paragraph is more damning than if they had just gone straightforwardly called him an oligarch.
Precisely, right? Absolutely precisely. So we have seen forms of blowback. We have seen forms of pushback. As one of the journalists I spoke with said, that there seems to be an indication that the dam has broken, in a sense, in terms of Blavatnik himself being described as an oligarch. And we do see increasing indication of that. The more publications that describe him that way, the more allowance there is, certainly on the editorial side, for describing him as that in future publications.
Yeah, we have a question from our colleague Ilya Zaslavsky. I'm going to actually modify Ilya's question because I think you've already answered part of it previously. But he's basically asking about Chinese influence operations and dirty money and oligarchs kind of doing the same thing. His supposition or claim is that the Chinese learn from their Russian past masters, I guess. I don't know if this goes beyond the remit of the report and the research that you've done, but how would you compare? I mean, because we're focused really on one kind of species of oligarch, which is the Russian post-Soviet kind. How would you compare their efforts, both at what they're trying to do in terms of sanitizing or whitewashing the image of themselves and their native regime, and also their attempts to silence or stifle or gaslight American media coverage? How would you compare the original Russian efforts to some of the more later generation Chinese, not even just Chinese, but who else? I don't know, South Asian or
I think, and that's a great question from Ilya, because this is an example that we have seen time and again play out, obviously, in the Chinese space as well. And the example that comes to mind, which I think Ilya mentioned in the comment, is the relatively recent revelations that Bloomberg, the outlet, not the former Democratic presidential candidate, decided to squash themselves an investigation into high-level money laundering out of or related to the Chinese state, those related to the CCP, family members of high-ranking CCP officials, and instead of publishing it, or instead of even publishing a version of it, simply pull it completely, which I think was an absolutely atrocious, horrifying and shuddering example of one of, as far as I'm concerned, the most successful effort at smothering critical coverage yet seen. I guess I can't quite think of a comparable example as it pertains to an American publication reporting on Russian money laundering, especially at that high level, that was simply squashed entirely. Now, obviously, as the report details, the pressure, the threats, the manipulation, the lawsuits, et cetera, absolutely are present. But I didn't uncover in my reporting any high-level New York Times, for instance, or high-level Bloomberg, for instance, reporting on Russian or post-Soviet money laundering that met or exceeded that example that we saw out of Bloomberg. Now, that gets into a whole other discussion of former Mayor Bloomberg's own relationship with the Chinese state. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there were concerns about that, and his descriptions of, Xi is somebody who's not a dictator, he has constituents, et cetera, which was, frankly, a horrible way to describe a dictator like Xi. I haven't seen anything, thankfully, manifest itself on that level of smothering and of just frankly shut down that we've seen elsewhere. You know, the Chinese example is an absolutely fascinating one, and certainly something that a future report is absolutely worth doing on, both in the American context, the Canadian context, especially the Australian and New Zealand context as well, in terms of a comparative, I mean, obviously the European example as well, but especially in terms of kind of the Anglosphere, especially the Pacific Anglosphere, in terms of shutting down critical coverage of the Chinese state and high-level Chinese money laundering, because that is an ample space for investigation and for examining the role that state actors, parastate actors, non-state actors, and oligarchic figures themselves push, and the kind of networks and overlaps that they share in common with their Russian colleagues, and the kind of policies that can combat that.
Great. Well, I think we've run out of time. We're just 1 minute over the mark. It's noon now, and I think that was pretty comprehensive and enlightening. I hope everybody enjoyed, and thanks very much for your comments. I want to thank Casey Michel, author of this really great report, Kill the Messenger, and also the Free Russia Foundation for putting this together and hosting this event. And I hope everyone has enjoyed it and is staying safe and sequestered. And thanks again for turning out under these rather strange conditions.
All right. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Michael. Thank you to the Free Russia Foundation. Thank you for reading the report.
Cheers.